here to speak on Is Teaching a Calling or a Profession? Teaching Literature in an Uncertain Age. Now, just this week on Tuesday, I was fortunate enough to be present when Seth received one of Stanford's highest teaching awards, the Dean's Award in the School of Humanities and Sciences. And I had the pleasure of hearing an absolutely incredible introduction that Rob Polhemus, Professor Polhemus in English, gave Seth, in which he discussed his many pedagogical and other virtues. And the elegance, the warmth, and the high literary achievement of that introduction would completely daunt me in doing an introduction myself, except number one, I was hoping that only Seth and I would be here and have heard that introduction. But now the introducer himself is here. I was going to.
It was a disgraceful.
It was fantastic. I'm going to borrow from that introduction, and thankfully I had already planned to cite properly. But thirdly, I was going to take some courage in the fact that Seth's CV provides wonderful raw material for any introducer. So Seth received his bachelor's in English from Wesleyan University with honors in magna cum laude in 1976. He went on to Oxford University to finish a second bachelor's in medieval English literature and historical linguistics in 1978. And then 3 short years later, which I'm sure is the envy of all graduate students here, he had completed a PhD in English from the University of Chicago. That same year, 1981, he began his professorial career as an assistant professor at Princeton, where he earned tenure and where he spent only 3 years as an associate professor before being promoted to a full professor in 1990. That year turned out to be very fortunate, however, because he was successfully recruited here at Stanford, where he's been a member of the English department, the Department of Comparative Literature, where he was also chair for 3 years, and since 2001, the Avalon Foundation Professor in Humanities. His research interests are very broad, spanning medieval and Renaissance studies, comparative philology, and children's literature. And they have resulted in 7 books, over 70 articles and reviews, and such prestigious awards as Guggenheim, NEH, and ACLS fellowships and visiting professorships at Washington University in St. Louis and Cambridge University in England. Amazingly, he has also found the time to give students the memorable pedagogical experiences that have brought him both the Hoagland Prize for undergraduate teaching and, as I mentioned, the H&S Dean's Award for graduate teaching. And if I can borrow something that Rob mentioned on Tuesday, apparently the only problem with Seth's teaching is it sometimes brings despair to his fellow teachers in the English department, even though it is a department known for its teaching because of his success in and out of the classroom. And in particular, Seth taught a course in Old Norse, something one wouldn't suspect rated students from other courses. We have the word of the chair that in fact some students gave up taking a course on Woody Allen studying Old Norse with Professor Lerer. Obviously, we have a fantastic person to talk to us about teaching.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak in this series. And contrary to expectation, I will be giving my talk in English today. Now, I made a few handouts, and we've clearly run out, but it might be possible for people to share. I'll be pretty much talking about everything that's in the handouts, and my first quotation in the handout comes from a New York Times story. Recently, the Times ran a story about government-funded research that was designed to show that attractive people are more successful than unattractive people. Okay? After months of research and countless thousands of dollars spent, the researchers conclusively proved that good-looking people get higher salaries, have more friends, and advance more quickly in their profession, especially the teaching profession, than bad-looking people. Okay? Sociological and psychological paradigms were invoked, cultural categories were interrogated. But at the end of the article, the supermodel Tyra Banks seemed to say it all, and she was quoted as saying, "God gave me these good looks, and I owe it to him to make the most of them. If he hadn't, I probably would have been a teacher." Okay. So, what does this statement mean about our social expectations of the teacher? First off, it gives voice to a notion of what we might call a professorial essentialism. The idea that God gave us something, that our lives are to some extent a gift or a calling. But second, it reveals that teaching is to some extent the default mode of the faulty. Teachers are unattractive or ungifted. Tyra Banks's comment is the flip side of the old adage, those who can do, those who can't teach. Those who look good model, those who don't teach. I want to use this statement as the opening gambit for my exploration of the teaching profession in the humanities. Now, this quarter, I'm leading a pedagogy workshop for the first-year PhD students in English, comparative literature, and modern thought and literature. And I'm also directing a new postdoctoral program in the humanities, which brings together 6 postdoctoral fellows a year to teach and do research at Stanford. Together with all the other things I'm doing, these current projects have made me acutely aware of the presuppositions behind teacher training at the university. They've helped me rethink the nature of humanities teaching in particular, and the broader pedagogical imperative to university research in general. In brief, the question that I'm raising today is, can we teach students to teach in the humanities? And how can we define, in practical terms, a notion of professionalism at a time when the humanities job market is contracting and our social expectations of literate experience are changing? In short, is teaching a calling or a profession? Is it something that you simply have, like Tyra Banks's good looks, or is it something that you can learn? So first, I want to define just what it is I do. I know many of you here, but some of you are new to me, and so I want to sort of give you a rough definition of what I think I do as a teacher of literature. My concern is not simply to get students to appreciate literary works, but to understand that literature itself is a way of understanding, through formal devices, the relationships between social life and the individual imagination. Literature, for all of its historical specificity or its authorial intention, is about form. In the words of my colleague Franco Moretti, I quote him, "Formal patterns are what literature uses in order to master historical reality and to reshape its materials in the chosen ideological key. If form is disregarded, not only do we lose the complexity and therefore the interest of the whole process, we miss its strictly political significance too." So it seems to me that if literature is a formal means of representing historical and social reality, then the teaching of literature should similarly offer formal techniques for its understanding. Teaching is not, at least to me, the unbridled performance of a kind of vatic spontaneity. Teaching literature is not about walking into a room, reading aloud some literary text, and waiting until inspiration hits. It's not about coming in and turning to the students and saying, "So, what do you think about Hamlet?" Or, "Did you like Dombey and Son?" Teaching is about organizing the critical analysis of how written style represents an imagined world, and furthermore, how that imagined world represents the historical environment in which the text was produced and read. Teaching uses formal devices and calls attention to formal devices in order to shape its material. Without form, to paraphrase Moretti, we lose the complexity and the interest of teaching itself. Now, to these ends, I think that college teaching is different from, let's say, high school teaching. And it's vitally important, I think, to let our undergraduates know, especially at the beginning of their time here, what those differences are. High school reading is about liking and disliking. It's about finding oneself in a character, about living or reliving life through fiction. It is, in short, about the reader rather than about the work. College reading is about style and expression. It is about learning the techniques of verbal representation, about the genres and social contexts that produce them, and about the craftedness of literary writing. It may also be about the lives of the authors and about the arc of productivity that shape an author's canon of works. Graduate student reading is about the textual mediations that get between an author's life and the techniques of verbal expression. It's about studying the particulars of historical and economic life that make books and the act of writing them commercial enterprises. It is also about the history of reading itself, about the books and texts that influenced another writer, about the politics of literary quotation, and about the influences that shape form and thus shape literary history. Now, another way of making these distinctions is by using literature itself to do them. Let's say that high school teaching, or to some extent high school and undergraduate literary experience, is Homeric. Students expect a face-to-face experience, a contact with reality. They want the true, the spoken, the lived. They want the sense of literature as full of great characters, as original, as direct. There are no written texts in Homer, no specific textual allusions. True, there is a social and a political world to the Iliad and the Odyssey, but Homer is composing centuries after the events he tells. The Trojan War or the wanderings of Odysseus take place for us in a kind of eternal present, an idealized time of heroism, adventure, and human resourcefulness. At least that's what we want to believe. Graduate school literary experience is, by contrast, Virginian. The Aeneid is a poem rich with textual allusion, a poem built on a whole history of epic form, of tropes and metaphors, figures and techniques. It is a highly wrought text, a literate text written down at a specific time and place, a text, therefore, that has a very specific historical, economic, and political argument. It is a poem of imperial Rome, an articulation of an ideology. It is also a poem that in many ways is about reading literature itself. There is a self-reflexiveness of the Aeneid, as we see its characters reading and interpreting inscribed objects, pictures, crafted works. It is a poem with a literary theory embedded in it, and for 1,500 years, readers found in Book 6 of the Aeneid, in Aeneas's hell descent, the embodiment, really, of an argument about the nature of the literary imagination and the rhetorical devices that mediate our apprehension and expression of the world. So to put it more directly, some people want literature and literary study to be a calling, Homer, and others want it to be a profession, Virgil. Our sense of the Homeric is that poetry is a calling, the blind bard accompanied only by his lyre and his imagination spinning out timeless tales. Our sense of the Virginian is that poetry is a profession, the literate craftsman taking on an assignment generated by political patronage, careful at every moment to reveal his reading or his knowledge, to contend with literary predecessors, to shape and reshape a world not just for entertainment and instruction, but for personal remuneration. So too we have Homeric and Virgilian teachers, though as I have already announced, I personally have little patience with the bardic seer, who comes in armed only with the plays of Shakespeare and her lyre, and, as the saying goes, wings it. Now, I want to pause for a minute. I looked up winging it in the OED, and what's fascinating is that, according to the OED, to wing it comes from the theatrical slang of the 1880s, to study a part from the wings, having undertaken it at short notice. Hence, to wing it, now in slang use, chiefly in the US, to improvise, to speak or act without preparation, to make statements on unstudied matters. But for me, the real scene of winging it is the opening of Paradise Lost. When Milton announces at the beginning how he looks for inspiration from his muse, he says, "Instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support." How can we be the Virgils, or for that matter, the Miltons of our classroom? I have proposed a set of guidelines for pedagogical activity in my current graduate student workshop, and I've handed them out here. I know we've run out of handouts, but maybe we can share. I'm going to go through them very briefly, and I'm giving them to you largely to take away so that you can get a sense of what it is I'm trying to do, but also because I really welcome your feedback, both today and in the future, for shaping this kind of material in future years. You've got several materials here. The first is my extended syllabus. Now you can see that this is a course which is devoted to practical training, to getting students engaged with the specifics of classroom performance and assessment. Each meeting that we have has at its heart a particular problem or a context for teaching in the English department in particular. For example, the undergraduate English major at Stanford, its nature. The first day, what do you do when you meet your class? How do you lead a discussion? How do you present material from your own research? How do you craft an assignment? How do you grade it? We did 2 weeks on grading where we handed out some papers that were generously given to me by Jim Marino from his IHOM class, and you did give them to me, didn't you? Yes. You're just shaking your head over generous. Or you're shaking your head over papers. And we had a fascinating experience reading through them and trying to see just intuitively what constitutes the act of grading. What do we notice? How do our comments establish a pedagogical, rhetorical, and personal relationship with our students in these ways? Outside the classroom, how do you work with students in office hours? What is the function of email and the like? And working with the lecturer. And in my last meeting, I'm going to talk about how to actually give a lecture. And those of you who are in that class who are here probably don't have to go to the last meeting because I'm showing you how to give a lecture. Now, in addition to that, I have some bibliography, histories of the profession, histories of criticism and theory, personal accounts, specific guides, and of course, at the very end, my favorite, the academic novels that dramatize, satirize, or critique the profession. And my personal canon of such novels includes Nabokov's Peniné, Kingsley Amos's Lucky Jim, David Lodge's Small World, and Francine Prose's recent book, Blue Angel. What I've also done is I've handed out something called Criteria for Teaching. That is, I went to the course evaluation sheets that TAs get, and everyone has to be evaluated by the students on certain criteria. So I went through and I said, well, what does this mean? Preparation. You know, how well prepared are you? What do you hope to accomplish in the section? What materials do you bring to the students? Clarity. How can you find ways of presenting material clearly? What constitutes clarity? How do you measure it? Development of thinking. How do you get your students to think about material in new or provocative ways? How can you respond to habits of mind in the classroom? In other words, where you're dealing not just with the content of what students say, but the way in which they're voicing a perspective on understanding. Feedback. What constitutes a good response? How can you be encouraging and also lead discussion? Explanation. What constitutes an explanation? What's the difference between a student asking for a point of information, like when did this happen, and an explanation about an argument, or a larger question about what it is you said? Leadership. How can you lead a discussion? What's the difference between leadership and authoritarianism? Questions, how can you ask a question and answer it? Availability, how are you on outside consultation? Overall effectiveness, the sum of your performance as a section leader. Now this is what we hand the students to grade TAs on in sections. And it seems to me that anyone who's going to be a TA should at least have a general sense of what these things mean and how practically one can prepare and respond. But what I also did was I opened some of this up, and I've got 2 pages here on discussion strategies, which are sort of like, you know, what does it mean actually to lead a discussion? How can you walk in and generate response? How do you start a discussion? What's a good opening question? What's a bad opening question? How can you provoke? I mean, can you really walk in and say, what's the dumbest thing you can think of about this text? I used to teach at Princeton, where I had a colleague who was a very famous novelist and short story writer. And because she was extremely famous, and because we all wanted to curry her favor, we actually let her teach courses in the English department. And her teaching strategy was, and I actually observed this, here's the Homeric Seth. I, with my own eyes, observed this. You know, I watched the, it's like the opening of that Pound poem where he quotes, but I, with my own eyes, watched the Sibyl. So she would sit there, she would sit there. It's like the New Yorker where they say, we're writing an article about people and we give them names, and for purposes of this story, let's call this person Joyce Carol Oates. So she would sit there, and if all the students were around her, and her opening gambit would be, now, what do you think is my favorite passage in this work? And the students would go around the room going, well, I don't know, is it the one where, where Pip says to Joe, blah, blah, blah? Is it the one where and it was like, I'm thinking of a number from 1 to 20, guess what it is, okay? Now, at the time I observed this, I thought this was sublime narcissism. But in a way, this teacher was really only being explicit about what a lot of teaching really is anyway. You see, because when we walk into a classroom and we say to the student, what do you think? Tell me what you think. If we had subtitles in our lives, the subtitles to a statement like that would really be, tell me what I think. See, tell me what you think I think. Tell me what I want to know. And what I'm suggesting is that discussion strategies, first of all, should be explicit about that. I mean, there is a power dynamic in the classroom. But it should be also clear that discussion is about getting students to talk to each other rather than getting students to talk to the discussion leader or to the professor. So there are a variety of ways of doing this. Textual analysis, that is, bring in a text that everyone can read. If you can focus eye contact away from you, you have a different dynamic in the class, even if that eye contact is this way reading, and then to the other students in some way. Avoid asking yes-no questions. That is, avoid asking questions that seem to have a right answer. Try to be alert in class. Try to act like you're interested. Try to act like you know the names of the students. If someone asks you a question and you don't know, you can say, I don't know. But you can say, I don't know, in a way without, undermining your authority. Whatever you do, don't wing it. Don't make something up. When did this happen? Well, actually, it happened in June of 1348. Really? I didn't know that. Yeah. A lot of people don't know that. What you can say is, I don't know, but I know where to look it up. And, I can look it up for you, or I've never really thought of that, or, I actually don't know, but what was it about the material that provoked you to ask that kind of question? And look for that kind of knowledge. And, I'm glad I had the chance to find it out after you look it up. Your question really provoked me to think in a new way about the material or to find something I didn't know before. I always have a rule also, which is never tell a student he or she is wrong. That is, never say in a classroom, that's just wrong, or you're wrong. There are creative ways of telling students they're wrong. Well, what leads you to that kind of question? Now, my students have taken classes with me enough to know that when I say, what leads you to ask that kind of question, they know that they're wrong. But I've avoided the esteem-lowering rhetoric of, you're wrong, in a way that makes the student sort of recognize, okay, what was there about my question that elicited this kind of response? And that kind of response back to the student gets the student talking again. Because if you just say you're wrong, the only thing the student can do is be quiet. And you want to maintain that level of discourse. The other thing that finally I think is extremely important is know how to end a class. A class does not end when you run out of time. A class does not end when we go, oh, look, we're out of time. A class should have an arc. It should have a trajectory to it. And there should be a moment in the class when the students know that they've gotten the point. They've gotten the idea, what you're trying to convey. If it's a reading, if it's a particular interpretation, if it's an argument, if it's a claim, there should be always a moment in the class when the students go, now I know, now's the take notes moment. Now's the highlighter moment. And at that point, the students know that, in effect, you have fulfilled the social contract with them in the class. Grading, too, is a social contract. And I have a sheet on grading here in the handout. I don't want to go through it in great detail, but I want to just talk about a distinction that I want to make philosophically or conceptually. Grading can be of two kinds. Grading can be a description or it can be an interpretation. That is, you may come up with what you think of as objective criteria for performance in written work or in the classroom. I've given an example in italics here of what a description-based grading system might be. The paper fulfills the assignment as it was presented. It does so in a clear and effective way. The writing, both at the sentence and the paragraph level, is unmarred by errors or infelicities. The vocabulary usage is strong and varied. Citations, evidence, and bibliographical material, if it was required, appear accurately and in support of the student's arguments. It is clear overall that the student took the assignment seriously and completed it with care. That's your benchmark. Now, you may decide that that's a B plus, an A minus, but you've got to decide what it is, and you've got to tell the students what it is. You've offered them a description of work that corresponds to a grade. Grade inflation is a real issue. I have a good friend who says A is for work that's not bad, B is for work that's not good. You know, many of our Stanford undergraduates, bright, motivated, sophisticated though they are, may feel in a humanities course or in a literature department that showing up, breathing under their own power, constitutes at least, you know, an A minus. In my personal experience, in all honesty, I have never given a final grade of B or lower and not heard about it. I have heard about it from parents. I've heard about it from students. You know, this is just the way life is. But I'm trying to suggest that if you come up with a description-based model of grading and you announce it at the beginning, everybody knows what the terms are. And then you say anything more than this is more than that as a grade. Anything less than this is less than that. The other version of grading is interpretation-based grading. That is, the grade is not a description of the work as an object. The grade is an interpretation of the student's performance. It takes into account things like effort or intention. It takes into account the performance of the other students in the class or in the section. That is, the meaning of the grade is relational, that it has meaning in relation to the student's work as a whole, all of the other factors in addition to the artifact of the work. And this is a kind of issue that I'd like to talk about with all of you at some later time, because I've thought a lot about this, and in preparing this course material, it occurs to me that grading really is the nodal point of many of the pedagogical problems and issues that we face. Now, Everything I'm talking about, of course, is not original with me. They reflect my distillation of a lot of reading about really the history of English department pedagogy, a history of my profession that has been, at least to my mind, most clearly and eloquently surveyed in Gerald Graff's book, Professing Literature and Institutional History. Now, one of the fascinating things about this volume is the way in which it brings together primary source material for the historical study of pedagogy. Much of what we debate today was vividly alive as arguments a century ago. And it's clear that what English professors worry about most may well be less the meanings of the work they study than the meaning of the work they do. The social positioning of the English professor has shifted, as we know, from the class-based indoctrinations of the late 19th and early 20th century Ivy League university, through the empirical scientific modeling of the mid-20th, to a host of other paradigms up to today: philology, anthropology, sociology, linguistics, psychology, and so on. It's clear that reading Graff's history, as well as many others that have been written in its wake, it's clear from this that the profession of English literary study and teaching has long been parasitic on other kinds of models. English professors once longed to be classicists. They longed to be historians. They longed to be anthropologists or linguists or philosophers and the like. The profession has historically sought an identity outside of itself. If that's true, why have English departments at all? How does the teaching and study of literature differ from that of other disciplines? One way of answering this question is to go back to the formalist issues that I raised at the opening of my talk. American academics have been arguing for a formalist autonomy of literary study since at least the 1890s. Graff quotes the chairman of the English department of Indiana University in 1895 as saying the following: "The study of literature means the study of literature," in italics, "not of biography or literary history, not of grammar, not of etymology, not of anything except the works themselves, viewed as their creators wrote them, viewed as art, as transcripts of humanity, not as logic, not as psychology, not as ethics." I love this statement. I love the viewed as their creators wrote them, because there's a sort of, wonderful sense in which literary creation is akin to divine creation. And there's a wild sense in which the literary artifact is seen rhetorically in this as something to be not simply understood, but something to be revered. But it seems to me that what makes departments of literature unique are not just these enduring formalist biases, which I think, in spite of the past 20 years of aggressive historicism, are still the default mode of teaching and in many ways the default mode of analysis. I mean, you can read new historicist writing, you can read new historicist analysis and find moments of what could, for all intents and purposes, be new critical close reading. It still remains, in some sense, the baseline of engaging with literature. In addition to this, though, I think that what makes literature departments unique and literary study unique is an attention to the material object of the book. Books are not simply bearers of information. They are things. There is a physicality to the printed page, to the handwritten manuscript, to the bound volume. There is, in much recent scholarship and criticism, a return to a kind of new bibliography and textual criticism. There's a fascination with the history of the book as the place where we explore social behavior and find the tensions in the published world between private life and public experience. A lot of my current research and teaching addresses these issues, both in scholarly and pedagogical terms of book history. And my interests lie not just in showing students the texts of literary works, but what I would call the paratexts, the errors, the variants, the marginal annotations, the material qualities of ink, paper, typeface, binding. Meaning is conveyed by these physical features as much as it is conveyed by words on the page. The social and the literary sense of literature is thus as a formally organized physical artifact, a thing we may explore or hold or see. To these ends, I want to wrap up with a polemic and with a story. My polemic is that the teaching of literature has to go on in the classroom and the archive. We need the books as physical items, not as CD-ROMs, not as internet sites, not as visions on a flickering screen. We need to recognize that when we teach, we are participating also in a process of physical engagement, eye contact, body language, movement. All of these features convey meaning to a student and to a teacher. They are part of the forms of social communication. They are lost over long distances. There is no substitute for being there in the classroom. Now, my subtitle to this talk has been Teaching Literature in an Uncertain Age. And for any graduate student, seems to me, beginning a PhD in an English literature department, these are uncertain times. What role should teaching preparation play in job placement? What pedagogical experiences should graduate students have? Should they develop a teaching portfolio or even a teaching philosophy? I've suggested here, at least by implication, that an attention to the forms and the materials of literature all have a pedagogic implication. Teaching is inseparable from research and reading, not just in that it enables us to organize our work, but in that all literary works have a pedagogical goal. Instruction in how and how not to teach can be found in the history of literature. From Homer's Demodocus, the bard whose name in Greek means teacher of the people, to Virgil's long-haired bard Iopus, to scenes of reading and teaching in Spenser, or in Milton, or in Dickens' Great Expectations, or in Frederick Douglass, to countless others. If I've argued for a notion of literature as formal and material, I now want to add that it's pedagogical. Literary works inscribe scenes of instruction within them because they are about instruction. They teach us, first and foremost, to read the works themselves. And they present the authors as their best teachers. Now, I could turn to a whole range of literary texts to illustrate this, but I'm going to close with one of my favorite examples, and that is E.B. White's Stuart Little, a novel which has been turned into a couple of films, but justice has not been done. Some of you who know the book may remember that moment when Stuart, on the road in search of his lost love, the bird Margallo, stops off in a small town in upstate New York and finds a man weeping on the sidewalk. It's the school superintendent, and he cannot find a replacement for one of the teachers. Stuart gleefully volunteers, though not without, we're told, changing, quote, into a pepper and salt jacket, old striped trousers, a Windsor tie, and spectacles. How to dress as a teacher. To the question of how can he maintain discipline, he replies, quote, of course I can. I'll make the work interesting, and the discipline will take care of itself. Stuart enters the classroom. Now remember, he's a mouse, okay? He's this big. And of course, he's a great hit. Spelling, math, geography, they all go by the board. And I'm summarizing this brilliant and extended passage to the point where he finally goes to the students and says, how many of you know what's important? The hands go up, and this passage is on the handout, but I'll read it. Very good, said Stuart, cocking one leg across the other and shoving his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Henry Rackmeyer, you tell us what's important. And Henry says, a shaft of sunlight at the end of a dark afternoon, a note in music, and the way the back of a baby's neck smells if its mother keeps it tidy. Correct, said Stuart. These are the important things. But you forgot one thing, though. Mary Bendix, what did Henry Rackmeyer forget? He forgot ice cream with chocolate sauce on it, said Mary quickly. Exactly, said Stuart. Ice cream is important. Okay. What's really important, as these students know, are not the rules that teachers such as I may make, but the aesthetics of the everyday, the poetry behind our lives, the sublime in the ordinary. A shaft of sunlight at the end of a dark afternoon. In this image lies the heart of artistry, the brilliance of an understanding. What in me is dark, illumine. But all this beauty requires care. A baby's neck is sweet, but only if its mother keeps it tidy. So too, in the classrooms of our imagination, we must keep things tidy. We must pay attention to the strictures and the structures of analysis, the patterns of both lyrics and lectures. Yet all of the strictures I may put in place are useless without an awareness not just of the way in which art represents reality, but of the way in which reality is full of artistry. After every exercise of understanding, there must be reward. Ice cream with chocolate sauce shows that the senses must not be neglected, that there is a mouth feel to the words we utter or the notes we sing. And this may be why so many scenes of teaching, from Homer through Dickens to Don DeLillo, take place over food and drink. Ingestion and instruction always go together in Western literature. Poor Tyra Banks. For if she should indulge herself in ice cream with chocolate sauce, she might neglect those good looks and, God forbid, have to make a living as a teacher. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I have to go teach at 5 after. I actually have to teach. So I think we've got about 15 minutes if anyone would like to ask questions or offer commentary or respond to anything I've said. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Maude, did you want to say something? Stuart was winging it, that's right. And in a way, the whole point about, but you see, Stuart is winging it in both senses of the term. Because not only is he making it up, but he reveals that teaching is a form of theater. He changes costume. He comes from the wings to the center stage. And that's what's so marvelous about this. Paula Moya came and talked to my pedagogy class yesterday. And one of the things she just tossed off in passing was, you know, she said, I have a theory about how you should dress as a teacher. And we never really got there, but in my after my afternoon graduate class, the student said, so how should you dress as a teacher? And it was quite clear that the real issue is we cannot lose sight of the theatricality, of the performativity of all of this. So that's true. Stuart is a great winger. Valerie? Mm-hmm. My answer to that is that they've been preparing all their lives for classes like that. And that what you're getting at moments like that is only the illusion of spontaneity. That an illusion that is perpetrated both on the professor and the student. Someone who's been teaching for 20 or 30 years knows what he or she thinks about a certain text, has a kind of internal anthology of key quotations, has a kind of Rolodex of remembrance for dealing with a given text. And yes, it's wonderful performance art to imagine that you're walking in and winging it. But what you're really doing at a moment like that is relying on decades of work. Jim? That's right. And it works great the first time you've heard it, except, when you come to realize, as we do with Homer, that these are formulae rather than inspired moments, then you sort of question the whole formulaic notion of everything. John? Mm-hmm. Right.
I wonder what you think that's a valid method, or what your version of the so-called Socratic method may be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question because so much of what we think of as the Socratic method is asking and answering questions in order to elicit movement towards a resolution or movement towards an idea. And, part of the question for me about the Socratic method really is how can I put it? How honest are we in that? That is, there comes a moment with especially savvy students when they know they're being led along. And the question for them is, how much of what I'm here for is the process, and how much of what am I here for is the answer? And, you know, I was in a class 3 years ago, and it was a course in, it was my senior seminar in comparative, for comparative literature students. And we were going through texts, and I was asking questions, and they were, you know, giving me answers, and then I was asking another question, and I was getting another answer. And finally, one of the more creative students in the class said, "Fuck the Socratic method. Just tell me what you want to hear." And the reason why I thought it was so remarkable was that he knew it was the Socratic method, you see? You know, so the Socratic method is still there, and it's clear that our students are still aware of it as a structural principle. Yes, Denise? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Right. Right, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, like, what is the social function? What is the social goal of studying and teaching literature? Why do we do it? Yeah. Why do we do it? Well, you know, the old answer was because it makes us better people. And I don't necessarily believe that. What I do think is that it makes us better personae. That is, if part of my argument is about the performative nature of teaching and the theatricality of experience, and if part of my argument is that, in some sense, we're all playing roles, and that what we're reading in literature are the ways in which individuals adapt to different social roles, then what literature, the why of studying and teaching literature, is that it helps us adapt to those social roles. It helps us mediate the interior and the social. Right. Right. That's right. Yes. Yes. I mean, I would say that, you know, in a way that the English major functions in that way, in the way in which, let's say, you know, rhetorical instruction used to work in the classical academy. That is, it is the discipline of disciplines. That is, it is the way in which we understand things like representation, interpretation, performance, speech, communication, and that these are the skills that we need regardless of what it is we're going to do in the world. So I want to separate content out from practice, performance, and skill in these matters. Because I think traditionally we think, well, you know, education is about content. I'm the empty vessel, fill me up. And part of what I'm suggesting is that the dynamic of being in an English class is a dynamic that you're not going to get necessarily in a math class, where, you know, as Patricia said to me, like, math teaching is, you know, the math professor standing up there at the board, reading the math textbook, writing out what's in the math textbook, so the students can copy down what the professor said was in the math textbook, you know. So, yes.
You talked about grading and
Sure. That's right. Right, so the criteria for classroom performance would be, you know, A, attendance, B, a level of engagement that shows that you are prepared, that you are also prepared to speak, and that you're also prepared not just to speak to me, but to speak with the other students. Those are, to me, the sort of minimum criteria. That doesn't say, and that what you have to say is smart or original or engaging, but it does say that you are prepared to engage. You're here to be more than just passive. That, to me, is the kind of baseline for performance in the class that corresponds to my baseline for performance in written work. It factors into, well, you know, when I teach a class, all the students want to know what percentage of my grade will be classroom performance. And I have to answer that, especially here. I mean, the undergraduates really want to know these things. And I can say, you know, undergraduate performance is 20% of your grade. And there's a little line in my grade book for undergraduate performance. You know, the exam is X percent, and this is Y percent. You know, and I've had students who come into me and say, what do I need to get an A? Actually, the sad thing is not that. The sad thing is a student who comes in and says, what do I need to get a B? But when I got here, I gave these answers that were, you know, like conceptual. Well, you need to do a work. You need to express a blah, blah, you know. And they didn't want to know that. They wanted to know, you know, like how many pages do I have to do, how many footnotes do I have, you know. This very sort of specific, detailed stuff, which is one reason why I came up with this level of definition, as to specify in really concrete terms, you know, what constitutes the level of performance that I'm expecting, and what in the social contract of grading you can expect in return by doing that. Was there another hand? Yes, Michelle. And then I think we'll need to wrap it up. I need to go. Me too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I like doing it, you know. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that, you know, this doesn't simply mean we should consider teaching as a performance entity when we make appointments, or when we consider people for review or renewal, or when we consider professional assessment. But I think part of it is we need to get even behind that and to say, you know, are we a teaching culture in some sense? What are the attitudes and conceptions that we have as departments or as disciplines or as units or as schools or whatever towards teaching? And I just want to respond to that in a very specific way. You know, it was wonderful to be at the ceremony on Tuesday where the Dean's Awards for teaching were given out. And it was wonderful to hear Rob, you know, talk about, you know, all of the things I did. But it was fascinating to see teaching award recipients from other non-humanities departments be introduced by their chairs and basically be told, well, we're giving her this teaching award because she showed up. She met with the students. She actually met class. She was available in office hours. You know, where I said to my, you know, and what I thought was beautiful was that the chair of the statistics department was giving an award to someone who taught in statistics, and he began by saying, you know, Professor so-and-so's teaching evaluations have consistently been from the 4.6 to the 4.9 range. And I thought, I felt like saying, hello, you're a statistics professor. Didn't you get it? So it's clear that, you know, that different disciplines have different cultures of teaching, and that the notion of teaching is just radically different. And as I think I said to some people there, one of the things that I realized about the English department and about the great thing about teaching at the English department is that we set the bar very, very high, but we also keep the bar open all the time. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, John.